Welcome to the second week of SLIS 757. Before I get started, I want to tell you that I've enjoyed reading your discussion board forum posts and your getting to know me introductions this week. I don't answer typically in all of my classes just because it can become overwhelming with 60 and 70 posts per class per week. So keep up the great work with your posts. This week's learning outcomes, you're going to understand adolescent development. You're going to learn about how we define young adult literature, and you'll have a brief overview of the history of YA Lit. Michael Cart in your textbook does a great job of providing more details about that. And I'll talk about gender issues. You'll learn about the LGBTQ literature in terms of realistic fiction and urban lit, and you'll learn about some of the books on your required reading list. So who are young adults anyway? What defines young adulthood? Now, when you registered for this class, the course description said that the concentration would be on ages 13 to 19, and that's true for the purposes of this class. YALSA goes a little younger and defines it at ages 12 to 18. Some people keep it K-12ish and say it's middle and high school grades 6 through 12. But to think of it in terms of when someone emerges from being a reader of children's literature and then emerges into young adult fiction, that period before they go into pure adult reading, I think is a better way. Nielsen and Donaldson have written textbooks about young adult literature, and I like their quote, "Those who think they're too old to be children, but who others think are too young to be adults." So basically my daughter. There are 3 different stages defined as early adolescence, middle, and late. You can see I bulleted the characteristics of the different stages. I won't read these to you, but it's interesting that students in middle adolescence become more sexually aware and higher risk takers. And then in late adolescence, you see them starting to see the adults as equals and maybe setting goals and being a little more adult-like. I've taught middle and high school, and I would say that that's an important jump, kind of more comfortable in their own skin in late adolescence than they are during the middle grade years. Those of you who have taught middle and high school can probably relate to some of these characteristics that you see here. There are materials that young adults consume, whether it's books or ebooks, whether it's the text-only graphic novels, audiobooks, playways that they can listen to, hard copy magazines, and digital magazines and video games. Young adult literature can also be all-encompassing. It's what students or patrons who are teens choose to read for their entertainment and enjoyment, or what they read to fulfill their actual school assignments. The definition I've already given you, but some of the terms have changed through the years. Some people call it YA Lit, as they do for this class, or teen books, adolescent lit, or tweener books, which is a newer term that's more for middle school. But the central theme that appears in young adult literature is that of becoming an adult. Who am I? And what am I going to do to move towards adulthood? Young adult literature, and oftentimes realistic fiction in particular, is a great way to help young adults develop lifelong reading habits. The importance of what they read and honoring what they read is in that Hipple article, which you read this week. That's a dated article, and I'm very aware of that, but I think the message is still the same. Our role as librarians and readers advisors is to find out, to discover that for our readers. There's a growing number of YA books published each year. The last number I read was something around 1,200, and I think it's way even higher than that now. Michael Cart does a great job of covering the history of young adult literature, but I'll just hit on some of the highlights from the field. YA Lit really started in the 1800s and was more didactic in nature with religious publications, teaching teens manners and virtues. Then it developed sort of into 2 fields. Domestic, which is a female field that preached morality, and then what were called dime novels, which were westerns and adventure novels that were more geared towards males. These dime novels had sort of predictable characters and were written in series. The very first books that are considered written exclusively for YA were Louisa May Alcott's Little Women and Horatio Alger's Ragged Dick, Street Life in New York. 1868 would be considered the very first year that young adult novels were published. Some of you may have heard of the Stratemeyer Syndicate, and that is the books that were knocked out, series books with assembly line idea, different authors contributing to it. Initially, it would have been what we consider the Nancy Drew, Hardy Boys, Bobbsey Twins, Tom Swift. Probably some of you remember Sweet Valley High. Those were the big popular series of books in the 1900s. Interestingly, several of these series are now available in graphic format and have been modernized for today's generation of learners. Then, in 1942, Maureen Dally wrote 17th Summer. A lot of people consider this to be when writing for teens and not talking down to teens really emerged. S.E. Hinton is author of That Was Then, This Is Now, but The Outsiders is really a standout novel in young adult literature by Hinton. The Contender by Robert Lipset is about boxing, and it really is one of the earlier multicultural books. Then in 1968, Paul Zindel was known for Pigmen. So you can see that the topics are getting to be more for teens. Love, fighting, The Outsider is about gang life, and The Pigmen is about teens and their relationship with a man in the neighborhood. I've seen lots of arguments through the years on listservs or at conferences about what is the first YA novel. People can argue about whether it's 17th Summer, The Outsiders, or others, but really a lot of people consider, based on this YALSA listserv, that the post-World War is when teens had more income, and there were more college grads, and the field of young adult literature really developed. That was then sort of talked about the past, and the future is for 21st century learners. They have things they want to read on their smartphones and iPads or their Kindles or Nooks. They're into new technologies and new literacies. They have different attitudes about reading because of the different formats and because of the way it's being taught in schools. Now schools allow for differentiated instruction, for example. We can identify what reading disabilities students have, whereas that wasn't as easy to do 20 and 30 years ago. And now we know how to help students with learning differences. There's a huge growing field of multiculturalism and diversity, whether it's in race or sexuality or culture, and also the needs to address burning issues that weren't tackled in the past, like sexuality. Michael Cart, the author of your textbook, states we need to trust young readers with the truth, that we can't sugarcoat hard issues, or as librarians and teachers and parents, we can't keep tough issues away from young adults. We have to trust that they're mature enough to tackle controversial topics, of which many exist in these readers' day-to-day lives. He thinks that young adult literature plays an important role in helping teens to become more tolerant and understanding. In short, it civilizes them. So even though some of the topics might be very hard-hitting, as in some of the ones that I'll be covering in this week's vidcast, he points out it's very important for youth as far as teaching them ways to relate to these issues and to others, and then to understand themselves and others. Realistic fiction tells about things that could happen but didn't really happen, since it's fiction. But if you're wanting to distinguish between fantasy or futuristic fiction, realistic fiction talks about life as it could be lived today, with real-life situations and true-to-life characters. A lot of people consider realistic fiction problem novels because these address teens' coming-of-age issues, but that's defining it too narrowly in my mind. There are a lot of different genres and topics that are under the umbrella of realistic fiction, and there can be genre fluidity. In other words, it can be realistic fiction, but it can be historical as well, or it could be realistic fiction that's a romance novel, or realistic fiction that's a sports novel. So there's a lot of genre crossing and bending when it comes to realistic fiction. The coming-of-age titles came about more in the 60s and 70s. Prior to that, there were more what people might consider quote-unquote happy books, with teens experiencing things in the novels after the 60s and 70s that were more about real-life situations, some of which you see here on the screen. It could be divorce, relationships with parents, death, bullying, suicide, mental health issues. This is more of what you've seen, particularly since the 70s and onwards, in terms of the genre of realistic fiction. Realistic fiction is also all-encompassing in terms of social, economic levels, and as far as the diversity of the geographic settings in which the stories take place. You'll often see a lot of profanity in realistic fiction, which some parents and administrators and teachers find offensive, but it really makes it all the more realistic. When you think of it in terms of, is this a realistic teen representation, hopefully you'll believe that the answer is yes, and that it's not overused in certain titles. Finding realistic fiction, you're going to learn more about the H.W. Wilson core collections and also the review sources that help you to identify realistic fiction titles and how to find them in your review sources worksheet assignment. LGBTQ literature is considered a subgenre, and it is a growing one in the field of realistic fiction. And for the purposes of this class, LGBTQ is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. You're going to be required to read one of 6 novels that are in this subgenre, and I'll talk about those in the upcoming slides too. But you'll notice from 69 to 76, there were very few publications with gay and lesbian themes. There were only 5, and the very first one was Donovan's I'll Get There, It Better Be Worth the Trip. They often range widely as far as their sensitivity to homosexual trans characters and as far as the political and social insight in the novels. A few years ago, the former ALA president had the quote that's on your screen about the importance of using these novels as tools in teaching tolerance and acceptance and the importance of diversity in the novels that teens read. The Stonewall Book Awards has been around a while, since the 70s, but it only recently tackled children and young adult divisions. The Stonewall Book Awards recognizes quality LGBTQ literature. I'm going to talk about the titles that you have a choice of reading for the LGBTQ required reading list, and some of these were Stonewall Award winners. The first of the 6 that you can choose from is Aristotle and Dante Discover the Secrets of the Universe. This book came out in 2012 to much acclaim. It's about 2 boys who are very different but become fast friends while they're both coming of age towards manhood. One of them is gay, and the other is sort of dealing with a lot of issues with his family and in his relationship with his father and his friends. It's truly about sexual and cultural identity. It's an excellent and enjoyable read. I'll Give You the Sun is one of my all-time favorites. It's by Jandy Nelson, and you can see the awards that this book has won. It's about twins, a boy and a girl. They're very different. The boy, Noah, falls in love with a boy who moves in next door. Jude is very outgoing, very popular, but something occurs that changes their lives forever and their relationship. And so they get to where they're hardly speaking to each other. Again, they're very, very different in their sexuality and their personalities. If you have an opportunity to read this one, I highly recommend it. Again, you can read it for different categories if you choose not to for the LGBTQ category. The Porcupine of Truth is by Bill Konigsberg. He had already been recognized for his first novel, which was called Openly Straight. This one is about a road trip in which a mother takes her son to go to be with her ex-husband and his father, who he's completely estranged from because he's an alcoholic and they live far apart. It's very difficult for authors to get starred reviews in multiple magazines, so Porcupine of Truth, newer title on your list, has a lot of humor in it, and I hope that you'll enjoy it. Rethinking Normal came out before all of the Bruce Caitlyn Jenner news. In this case, the author is writing autobiographically because she's talking about her life as a male young boy who wants to be a female. It's very honest and open. You know, some of the medical issues are brought in, the surgery that she went through, the bullying that she experienced all of her life, the different ways that her 2 divorced parents handled it. But it's very strong as far as a transgender memoir. I highly recommend Rethinking Normal as one of your required readings for this area. Ramona Blue by Julie Murphy is the most recently published title on the list. This is Julie Murphy's 3rd YA novel. Her second book, Dumplin', received a good bit of positive press. It's an excellent read. I've included a brief description here, a link to the author's website, and also a link talking about the controversy surrounding the book. When early news about the book was made public back in October, the blurb included the description of Ramona as a lesbian who then, quote-unquote, discovers she is bisexual after falling for a boy. The LGBT community reacted very negatively to this, feeling it was a problematic portrayal. Of course, many folks had not read it, just the preview blurb. So as a result, a large number began posting 1-star reviews on Goodreads. Personally, I think you should read the title before you judge it. So if you choose to read Ramona Blue, I'll be interested to hear what you have to say. Two Boys Kissing is considered a seminal work in the field of LGBTQ literature. It's actually based on true events about 2 boys who take part in a marathon. They want to bring attention to the world, and so they have a marathon and set a Guinness World Record. David Levithan is not only a very, very popular and prolific young adult author, he's also an editor for Scholastic Books. I love his quote in terms of realistic fiction that a story doesn't always have to reflect reality, it can create reality as well. He talks often about how shocked he is when he is approached by librarians who tell him they don't have LGBTQ books in their schools because the teachers or parents or administrators say it might encourage homosexuality. His comment is, it's there. You need to make materials available so that students see themselves represented in fiction and can get through these issues.